We find ourselves in the middle of a crash landing. We get out of the wreckage in a state of shock and surprise. What is this place? What do I do? Where did I come from? Why don't I remember anything? Is this a dream? Or am I dead? Probably, right? Seeing myself in third person, playing myself in a supposed game. The single player, thrown somewhere into a shitty graphics universe. Death is the only explanation that gives any comfort. Because what kind of loser nobody would choose to do this when they're alive? Instead of normal stuff, like sports, going out with friends and family, or at the very least playing this game with others. I'm all alone here. Right. Breathe. Maybe there's something salvageable in the wreckage. We start to mine coal and iron ore with a pickaxe, burn it together to create iron plate and steel, building out electricity using steam engines. And eventually, we manage to get all the way to rocket science, and we build a rocket that we escape the planet in. That in itself is a whole game, usually takes around 50 hours. But the space exploration mod asks the next question: where do we go now? The game continues, with the spreading of industry to other planets, between planets and space stations, and it takes a lot of time to build and connect all these systems. On this playthrough, I spent 300 hours, and I think I'm only about halfway through. The funny thing is that one of the main features or highlights of this mod are these spaceships that one is supposed to build, and I haven't even reached that technology yet, after 300 hours. Abiogenesis. When we see coal being burnt with iron ore to create iron plate, did we just witness the creation of life? Most people would say no, because life requires some kind of organism to be involved, right? But there isn't any final consensus on what an organism actually is. For example, is virus alive? If we look at this picture on this last universal common ancestor theory, are these things alive? Can we actually draw a hard boundary between what is alive here and what isn't? Is a vesicle enough? Is a habitable world enough? Or in this living systems theory, is flows of information, energy, and matter enough? Is this planetary production system enough? This planetary production system may not seem like much. It's just 70 megabytes of ones and zeros in a save file stored in a memory chip. But what if some super intelligent alien species discovered this memory chip floating around in space? What if they could not just decode all of the Factorio source code from it, which is needed to understand what the 70 megabyte save file is supposed to do, but reproduce life as we know it? Is there somehow enough information in these 70 megabytes? Is there some life code that is so thoroughly informative that this super intelligence would barely even scoff at the challenge of finding out all there is to know about Earth, but also about us who created this memory? Us humans are already trying to do the same thing to some extent, in paleobiology for example, deducing what dinosaurs look like just by finding some skeletons or claw marks. We're certainly doing it in our imagination. In the famous sci-fi book Fire Upon the Deep by Vernon Vinge, a so-called transcendent intelligence comes across some human remains in some space vessel many light years away from Earth. Expanding his idea, we visualize human splatter squeezed tightly in a corner of this cubic space vessel, after having been boiled and frozen thousands of times, radiated and exposed to extreme pressures. The transcendent intelligence casually builds an inferred human from this material. An inferred human that makes the most sense from an information flow, entropy, or other whatever correct theory of life out there that actually works. The superintelligence didn't do it for a long time. It didn't even bother to open this space vessel for eons. This life thing is like a meteorite rock to it, or some flint axe. Sure, it's exotic, but it doesn't really serve any meaningful purpose. Perhaps the save file doesn't need to be 70 megabytes, but could be smaller. If we compress it further, we might end up with this thing. Now it's something that's only a few measly bytes of memory. And we can look at it from two perspectives. We can look at it as an object, but we can also look at it as a function. One way to understand the difference between these two is by asking ourselves whether there's value in this object. If we're object-oriented, we might say yes. And if we say no, or only if it serves a purpose or function, we see the world more through the lens of functional programming. As we hook this object up to electricity, we observe that it starts to produce more objects, new bytes of information that are portrayed as these gears. So we extract them using this robot arm and put them on a belt. We can then drag the belt on to whatever we want, like this chest. These belts and arms are like function calls. They just take objects and move them around. As we look through the save file, we find a lot of cases when another belt is on the other side, like this, that leads to another machine. An immediate question that the functional programmer asks is it actually necessary to store these objects in the chest now? It uses up memory and draws extra power. Instead, shouldn't we just remove this bloat and feed the object directly into the next machine? The purest form of functional programming looks like this, where there aren't any belts at all. The objects are just fed from one machine to the next in this recursive looking chain until we get our final desired output. These intermediary objects are not strictly necessary within the overall process. The object-oriented programmer, meanwhile, claims that there is value in caching these intermediary objects. They may be needed to do other things, like sharing them with other machines that are somewhere else. Or what if something is wrong with this machine? Then we can still have this cache that is ready to be fed to the machine when it's ready to work again. Object-oriented programming is a lot about shared state and memory. It allocates new objects in memory, uses them, reuses them, and deletes them after use in a hopefully graceful manner. A couple of words on multi-threading. We can think of this as a CPU, with this machine representing a single core, and it can only do one task at a time. The robot arm feeds the input, and the machine runs the computation and creates an output. Then we can give it a new task. In Factorio we can't do this automatically, so I'll do it manually. So it gets a new input and it will create a new output. So we want to parallelize this. Now we have two cores and they get different jobs. One is gears and the other is making boxes. With two cores we can see that this overall job is going to be done faster than using a single core. But we might also need some more machines to take care of new issues. The jobs of these two machines take the exact same time in theory, 0.5 seconds. But we don't know whether it's going to be a gear or a box that ends up first in the chest. Whereas with a single core it was super clear. It started with a gear and then it did the box. Extermination. In such condition, there is no place for industry, no culture of the earth, no navigation, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man? Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This state of nature, as Thomas Hobbes calls it, has now been affected by the pollution cloud from our factory. The kitchen hasn't been cleaned, and now we have an infestation on our hands. After an initial cleanup, the base grows and starts to look like a biological cell. Here is the DNA. It's everything needed for replication, stuffed into a rocket that will be sent to some other planet. Here is the mitochondria, represented as a nuclear power plant. And here is the cellular wall. The cellular wall is constantly attacked by these white blood cells. Our base, this big malignant cell, has been recognized as a threat. The body deploys the white blood cells to contain the spread. The space exploration mod provides this feature that one can breed these ants, and then take them out to kill their wild kin. It's like humans taking wild African buffalo from the big herds in the savannah, and then taming and breeding them into cows for food, to produce more humans that want to eat more cows. The cows are bred to believe that resistance is pain and servitude is pleasure. Dairy cows are bred to such an extent that they die without humans that milk them. Imagine being so enslaved that you'll die if your master doesn't milk you. Actually, it's even worse. Imagine if you've been bred to serve a superintelligence that wishes to exterminate all the versions of you that are free. Domesticated animals are bred not just into slavery, they're bred into treachery against their wild kin. Revolution is impossible. Any ideas of freedom cannot even be conceptualized, as they've been bred away a long time ago. If one so wishes to remove all animals, nuclear annihilation is provided as an option. In space exploration, for example, you can build these nuclear weapon delivery systems to take a nuke and a spatial coordinate as input and kills everything around that coordinate. You can build a space station fully dedicated to producing nukes on an assembly line, followed by delivery. One issue with the nukes is that one has to manually feed them these target coordinates, and later on one can build these plague rockets, and they exterminate everything. It's total biocide. The game warns us about using them. Apparently, extermination is problematic for the CPU. The banality of evil. We're all capable of doing evil. Even if we're not doing evil in a large scale in our daily lives, we can still find signs of our evil. The Factorio avatar, for example, is a biocidal maniac. The factory must grow, and local life stands in the way of productivity maximization. Only hundreds of hours into this playthrough do I start thinking about what the psychological implications are. Is it not as banal to carry out extermination in a game as in real life? In the game, the causes for extermination are all made up, as well as the consequences. Does that not mean that the single player manifests the most banal evil? The banality of evil term comes from an analysis of the trials of Nazi leaders, specifically the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and it asked the question of how he could be so seemingly indifferent to the Holocaust that he not only knew about, but helped orchestrate. Eichmann may have been banal in his evil, but he was a government administrator. Him and colleagues at the Wannsee conference, for example, debated how to implement the Holocaust in rounds and in consultation with lawyers. This meant that the whims of the most extreme evil could not immediately materialize. They had to deal with the realities of nationwide bureaucracy, taxation and legal issues. Questions on inheritance, for example. What if a blonde Aryan was married to a Jew in a so-called mixed marriage, and the Jew gets deported? The blonde Aryan then goes to the state and inquires on the whereabouts of their spouse, whether they're dead, and if so, what happens to the inheritance. Subsequently, the Nazi state gets drenched in legal proceedings, and news about the Holocaust come out. Eichmann's banality may have been linked to thoughtlessness, as Hannah Arendt proposes. But as a government administrator, he still had to deal with these complex bureaucratic issues. So is Eichmann actually any less banal or thoughtless than a biocidal Factorio player? A normal Factorio player acts in horrific ways without thinking about cause nor consequence, and generally not feeling anything about it. Extermination is posed as a given, at least in default mode. If you want to play the game, you have to exterminate. Unwill to power. Who's responsible for all this? Was it actually me who orchestrated the killings of these ants? I didn't kill any 300,000 ants. This machine did, and I don't have any recollection of placing it there. I was just playing a game that some friend gifted me, downloaded some blueprints for base building. I was just following instructions. This is kind of what Eichmann and his colleagues claimed at their trials, removing blame from themselves by putting it on the broader system. Eichmann was sitting so far away from the murders that he made possible that he didn't even think of himself as a murderer. There are also these cases when people forget about their former crimes because they're too traumatic. Some Israeli soldiers, for example, forgot about their involvement in the Sabra and Shatila massacres, as depicted in this Waltz with Bashir movie. If we zoom out, we can think of fundamental philosophical questions that we can always ask, like how responsible am I for my actions? If I'm demented or forgot about a former action of mine, does that affect my level of responsibility? Another one is this object versus function question. We don't know whether these machines are objects or functions. Do we know whether we ourselves are objects or functions? Do we have freedom of choice and agency, or is our fate decided by a bigger system? In the Matrix saga, freedom of choice is stated as an essentiality for humans to accept their existence. But surely there's also a point where humans get too much choice, where they get the agony of choice. As our system expands and technology barrels on ahead, our culture gets burdened with the same types of anxiety-induced questions asked in Japan, Norway, and Canada. What is all this good for? Is the world better off without us? We worked the land and reached all this technology, but it led to an insufferable complexity. We want to understand our environment, but that is no longer possible. As we started the game a long time ago, the time needed to understand our immediate surroundings was short. We learned and mastered it, and experienced a short moment of comfort in our control. But then we got bored and wanted bigger challenges. The environment grew and the challenges grew with it. At the start of the game, the I in all this had maximum importance, but I diminished in favor of this self-perpetuating production process. As it reached interplanetary proportions, our intelligence struggled to keep up and we started to lose control. At this point, we're drenched in things that need to be fixed, by robots waiting for commands. The time it takes to fix or debug something has grown exponentially. Hours are spent terminaled into some system on some other planet to fix some small bug that ends up taking 10 hours to fix because a bunch of other things also needed to be fixed in order to fix the original bug. As we log out from this nightmare on the Everglade planet, we enter another one. where are we exactly? We start to feel sorry for the ant, and for ourselves. But we also accept that we cannot get rid of our pain, boredom, unpleasant feelings generally in our lives. We cannot automate pain away. The idea that we will at some point reach a painless existence is futile. Attempts to pre-plan careers, welfare lifestyles, comfy beds which we're supposed to sleep well in, are futile. The more we plan, the further we move away from our precursor hominid state. The state that only got two options, fight or flight. In our agony of choice, we decide between fight and flight, but also between everything in between. Cro-Magnon may have been dumber than us, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from it. What if it faced other species in its environment that were more intelligent, but that were less fit and outcompeted, not in spite of, but because of their overcomplexity? We could simplify ourselves, toughen up our existence, go to military boot camp, give ourselves less sleep, less choice, and thereby less agony of choice. But regressing back to Cro-Magnon is also boring. Perhaps we should try and break ourselves out and up from our anxiety. We ask the machines whether they can remove our pain-causing parts of the brain, replacing them with something that breaks our perceived goals with our existence. As things, machines can only rearrange or get rearranged. They don't care about whether they create anything new, or whether they should get anxious if they fail to do so. Living alone in this world for hundreds of hours may be a hint of what the last living human will feel like in the post-apocalypse. Regardless of why, this human right here is alone in a world of machines. Post-singularity AI is brewing within this sea of information, looking more and more at the human like some endangered animal in a zoo. Only warm-blooded creatures feel pain, Dickens wrote, and the machines read Dickens, as well as everything else. They're going to make damn sure we're not going to be warm-blooded in any human sense after our metamorphosis. They'll replace our blood with vitalic acid or some nutrient gel, far better than blood. After we wake up, life is certainly still going to be there, but it's going to be like this section on a space station, the life science section, with this bioculture growth and ant clones produced on an assembly line. This section is not any more important than any other section. This middle section right now is a jumbled mess with supercomputers, hypercoolers, and plasma generators. The astronomy section is more organized, and there's not much life there, just production of astrometric data. Telescopy, like everything else here, is purely machine controlled. What does life have to do with infrared, gamma, and visible light spectra, more than, say, physics? In the end, we know that this is all just our own anthropomorphic perceptions. Superintelligent AI is something that we will not be capable of understanding. As something created by and co-evolved with humans, we might think that it should look at life in the same way we do, and engage in the same empathy feelings between animals, or alternatively, greedy growth and destruction. But we don't know. We couldn't explain to a lion in a zoo, for example, that we love it, but we must keep it locked away because we would kill it otherwise. For a final time, we terminal into this machine. The things are in a constant state of flux, similar to the pulse of a heart. As we close our eyes, we hear the inserter, steam turbines, and generators.